Now it is time to enhance our batiks. First, I want to talk about this batik in particular. When looking at it, the image is very flat and boring. So as far as my aesthetic goes, I want to add more variations of color as well as shades, so that way it looks more three-dimensional and an overall more interesting design. Now I'm going to add darker shades of color to add more dimension to this overall design. The first color on this flower is a lighter pink, so what I'm doing is adding a darker fuchsia, and then I'm going to blend in the color to the lighter pink. I'm doing it on dry fabric so that the dye has a feathered look. If it was a wet dye, it would blend more. Next, you will learn how to two-part dye. The first step to a two-part dye is to add wax to preserve the dye that you have already laid down. So here I am adding wax lines to preserve the light green color that I had already laid down previously. After I added the wax to preserve my color, it is now time to add my dye. I'm using a paper towel to put underneath my brush when I'm transferring the dye over to the leaf. This way I'm not dripping dye into unwanted places. So notice how the light green and the white part of the batik is still being preserved because that is where I laid down the wax. So now the dye is only getting in the areas that I want it to. Next, I'm going to add more wax to preserve the dye that I just put down of that darker green. I'm using a smaller brush for smaller details to make sure I'm not putting wax in unwanted areas. Here I'm using the bigger brush to apply more wax to preserve the dark green and the light green that I added. Now, all the places I didn't add the wax, I'm going to add darker shades to. And I'm also going to use a black underneath the leaf to show dimension and shadow. Here I'm adding black to show shadow and more contrast to my overall design. Because I added wax, my black isn't going too far, blending in unwanted areas. Now I am adding the same shade of green dye because when you add another layer of green dye, it is going to make the shade darker, but you have to make sure that it is dried in between. And on the right side and left side, it looks like it's the same shade, but it is not because that part is still covered in wax, so after it is ironed, it will be much lighter. Now let's go over the color order of what these leaves are going to be. There are 5 colors total on the leaves. Here where I'm pointing is going to be the white parts. And then there is the light green that got preserved with the wax. And there is the darker shade than the light green. And then I went in with my black shadows and in the center making the darker green.